He didn't hear me at first. No one did. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound barely registered. Soft as breath. The room smelled like old wood polish, and something faintly medicinal, a scent I hadn't noticed since my grandfather's hospital days. Dennis was already mid-sentence, voice smooth and practiced, reading from the will like he was narrating a business memo. His words were clipped, emotionless. A few cousins nodded along, others looked bored. Nobody noticed the empty chair at the far end of the table. The one meant for me, the one he thought would stay that way. I walked forward slowly, the envelope clutched in one hand, the weight of it anchoring me to every step. No apology, no fanfare, just movement, quiet and deliberate, like I belonged there because I did. When I reached the head of the table, Dennis finally saw me. His eyes twitched before the rest of his face caught up. For a second, he didn't speak, just blinked, once. Then his voice returned, sharp with surprise. "Who told you to come?" he asked, each word dipped in disbelief, not concern. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I slid the envelope across the table toward the estate attorney. It landed with a soft thud, beige paper against polished mahogany. The room froze. He reached for it carefully, almost reverently. Slipped his finger under the seal, pulled out the contents. One letter, one legal amendment, and a small card in my grandfather's handwriting. The silence was no longer empty. It was dense, waiting. The lawyer cleared his throat, read. And as the words unfolded, my name, the deed to the lake house, the confirmation of the amendment. Dennis's face strained of color. His fingers clenched around the armrests of his chair. Around us, the air cracked, and Sora let out a soft gasp. My cousin Yena looked between Dennis and me, like she'd missed an entire act of a play she thought she understood. But I said nothing, because the moment had already spoken for me, and the truth? The truth had arrived, sealed and signed. Fade to black. He always wore linen, indoors, even in winter. Said wool made him itch, and sweaters felt like armor. I'd find him at the window in his house slippers, hands wrapped around a chip mug, humming something I never recognized. Always looking out, never quite away. The promise wasn't grand. No cinematic music, no deliberate gravity. Just one afternoon in late September, pruning the bonsai on the porch, his white hair brushed back and his voice low. "I want you to have the lake house," he said, as casually as someone offering tea. "It needs someone who sees stillness not as emptiness, but as something full." I didn't know what to say. Just nodded and passed him the shears. His fingers were slower than they used to be, but steady. Always steady. That year, I moved in without fanfare. I'd just left a job that had slowly hollowed me out, and he needed someone to help with appointments, groceries, the little things that get tangled when your knees start giving out and stairs become a daily negotiation. It wasn't noble. It wasn't planned. It was just right. We shared quiet in that house, mornings with tea, evenings with the news playing too low to really hear. I did the laundry. He taught me how to care for orchids without overwatering. We talked sometimes about my mother, about his garden, about things that never made it into photographs. He never talked about the will. Not directly. But some days, he'd hold my wrist longer than needed when passing a cup. Other days, I'd catch him watching me with a look I couldn't name, equal parts pride and apology. Then one night, I found him at the kitchen table with papers spread before him. Not chaotic, just organized in the way older men tend to be. Lined envelopes, a notepad with bullet points, a fountain pen resting diagonally on a folder labeled in block letters, Addendum. He didn't look up, just said, If anything ever feels off, Ava, you'll know what to do. He tapped the envelope with 2 fingers, then folded it into a drawer I wasn't meant to open. At least not yet. The next morning, we didn't speak of it, but something in me knew. He'd already said goodbye in his own careful way, and in that moment, without pomp or pressure, he'd made the promise real. It was a Wednesday when the call came. Rain traced patterns down my window, and the kettle had just begun to sing. I let it whistle a second longer than usual before turning off the burner. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. My Uncle Dennis. Not as a man, but as a representative of duty. The family's gathering on Saturday for the formal reading, he said. Figured you'd want to know. There was no warmth, no condolence, just the facts, stripped of softness. I assume the attorney has your updated contact info, he added. Updated. The word stuck in my throat like ash. We hadn't spoken since the funeral. Not truly. Just stiff nods across pews, the kind of brittle silence that holds too many unspoken things. He'd given a eulogy that sounded rehearsed, detached, a list of titles and accolades, as if our grandfather had been a resume instead of a man. On Saturday, I didn't go. Not because I wasn't invited, but because something about the timing felt wrong. I told myself I needed more time, that grief moved slowly, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to see what they would do when I wasn't there. Dennis had always wanted the lead role, the responsible son, the family man. But even as a child, I could see it. The performative charm, the way he smoothed his voice around elders and narrowed it when no one else was listening. Later that evening, my cousin Yena called. You weren't in the room, she said, hesitating. So, I thought you should know. I leaned against the kitchen counter, phone pressed to my ear, her voice threading through the quiet. Dennis said your name wasn't in the will, that Grandpa changed it. No mention of why. Silence. I heard her shift, uncomfortable. He didn't look at anyone when he said it, just read it like a line. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the steam still rising from the untouched mug beside me. My name wasn't in the will, no explanation, no letter, no mention, only a mission. I stood there for a long time, listening to the house settle. Then I reached for the drawer, the one he'd told me not to open, unless. And I knew, with a clarity that didn't tremble, unless had arrived. The envelope was heavier than I remembered, not in weight, but in meaning. I held it in both hands, like it might shift if I wasn't careful. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I set it on the table beside a cold mug of barley tea, then turned on the small desk lamp my grandfather used for reading. Its glow was soft, golden, the kind of light that didn't demand attention but offered comfort. The letter was sealed with a thin strip of wax, faded red, cracked at the edges. My name was written in Hangul, Abba. His careful script, unmistakable. Not Ava, not English, just that. As if he'd written it only for the part of me that remembered sitting at his feet while he shelled chestnuts and told stories he never told anyone else. My fingers trembled only once, then stilled. I broke the seal. Inside, a folded page, yellowed slightly, and a smaller envelope marked for the attorney. I unfolded the page first. Ava, it began. If you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong. Or maybe just sideways. I hope I'm wrong. I hope Dennis did the right thing. But I've lived long enough to know the shape of a man's ambitions, especially when they've been sharpened over decades of being overlooked. This is not about bitterness. It is about protection of you, of what I meant to leave behind. I paused, breath shallow. You stayed when others drifted. You listened when I was silent. You asked nothing of me but my presence. And for that, I leave you the one thing I always meant to: the lake house. The deed is filed, the amendment notarized. If the reading does not include your name, present this. The envelope marked for the attorney contains everything required. They may not like it, they may question it, but truth, Ava, does not need their permission, only your courage. With pride, Appa. I sat back, the letter slack in my hands. The lamp buzzed faintly. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the trees like breath. My name. The lake house. A notarized amendment. He knew. He saw Dennis coming long before I did, and he left me not just the house, but the instruction to act when silence became suspicion. I picked up the second envelope. Ran my fingers along the edge. It was time. I dialed the number from memory. Not because I'd used it often, but because I'd watched my grandfather call it so many times that the pattern lived in my fingers. 3 rings. Then the familiar voice, measured, dry, with just enough softness to suggest discretion. Charles Lind, estate law. I didn't introduce myself, just said my name. There was a beat, a pause filled with recognition. Miss Kim, he said, tone shifting, I was expecting you. I didn't ask why, I already knew. I received something, I said, from him. There's an amendment. I have a copy, he replied, filed and time-stamped. Your grandfather insisted on dual documentation, one for me, one for you. Of course he did. I assume this concerns your removal from the will, he added, as if already knowing the answer. Yes, I said. My uncle, he didn't say much, just that things had been changed. Quietly, no explanation. Silence hummed on the line. Then, I wasn't consulted on that version, Lynn said. I requested to review it before the reading. Dennis declined. Said it had been finalized elsewhere, but I knew your grandfather's wishes. I drafted the amendment myself. Something inside me, tight and coiled, unwound slightly. He told me to bring it, I said, if anything felt off. It does, he replied. More than you know. I didn't press. He wouldn't say more over the phone. Too careful for that, but the undercurrent was clear. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't wrong to feel the shift beneath the surface. I'll be at the next reading, I said. I want this done officially. No surprises, he agreed. And just before we hung up, he said something that surprised me. Your grandfather, he trusted very few people, but he spoke of you often. Said you had his eyes, not just the shape, but the sight. I didn't know how to respond, so I just thanked him, hung up. Then I sat at the table, the letter beside me, the envelope ready, and I waited. I read it again that night. Not because I doubted what it said, but because I needed to memorize it, to feel its weight in my chest before I placed it in anyone else's hands. The paper was thin, the kind that creases easily. His handwriting, black ink, slight slant to the left, every stroke deliberate. There were no flourishes, no wasted words, just intention. I thought about how long he must have planned it, when he'd written it, how he knew the battle would come after he was gone, not before. I imagined him sitting at the same kitchen table, breathing through the aches in his fingers, pressing pen to paper without knowing if I'd ever have to use it. But he'd written it anyway, because that's what he did. Prepare for storms before the clouds ever formed. I placed the letter back into the envelope, then folded the smaller legal document, the notarized amendment, along the crease he'd already made. The stamp was clean, the signature fresh even under glassy lamplight. This wasn't a note, it was a weapon. One meant to cut through lies, sharpen not with venom, but with proof. I sealed both documents inside a plain folder. No labels, no names. Just the quiet strength of paper protected by its own simplicity. Then I stood and crossed the room to my coat rack. Pulled the long beige trench coat from the hook, checked the pockets, slid the folder into the inner lining where it would stay pressed against me, unseen. The lake house was never just about property. It was memory. The summers spent in silence. The smell of pine needles baking in the sun. The way he'd hum while fixing the railing, sleeves rolled to the elbow, jaw set with quiet focus. He'd promised it to me, not out of guilt, but of gratitude. For the year I gave when no one else showed up, he wanted it to go to someone who wouldn't flip it, sell it, gut it for profit. He wanted it to live, and that meant this letter. It wasn't a plea. It was a command, one I intended to follow. I didn't rush. That's the part Dennis never understood about me. He moved like a salesman. Even his grief was fast, efficient, polished for presentation. I moved like stone, deliberate, grounded, and once I decided something, I didn't turn back. I spent the next 2 days in quiet preparation. There were no outbursts, no text messages sent in anger, no dramatic calls to family, just lists, a carefully packed tote, the folder checked twice, one spare copy of the amendment tucked into a sealed envelope, addressed to myself, postmarked just in case. I reviewed my grandfather's original will, the public version. Dennis had made sure copies were circulated quickly. There was no mention of the lake house, only vague language about equal distribution among remaining descendants, which Dennis interpreted to mean himself. It was the omission that burned. Not because I wanted more, but because I knew what had been promised, and I knew what had been erased. The night before the reading, I stood at the bathroom mirror brushing my hair into a low braid. The strands fell into place like muscle memory. My mother used to say that women who braid their hair before battle always know what they're walking into. I wasn't angry, not anymore. Just clear. That morning, I chose a soft gray sweater and black slacks. Neutral, controlled. I pulled the trench coat over my shoulders, buttoned it to the collar. The weight of the folder inside felt like an anchor, not burdensome, just grounding. The car ride to the firm's office was quiet. No music, just the soft click of turn signals, the familiar rhythm of city traffic. I parked 2 blocks away, chose to walk the last bit, let the air settle me. When I reached the lobby, the receptionist barely looked up. "Family reading," I said. She nodded, gestured to the elevator. I stepped inside. Alone. The doors closed with a whisper, and as the floors ticked upward, I breathed in through my nose, slowly. Let it settle. This wasn't a confrontation. It was a correction. The hallway outside the conference room was quiet. Carpeted, muted like a waiting room, with no music, just the hum of distant air vents and the soft thud of my boots. I paused just outside the door. Through the frosted glass, I could hear voices. Low, controlled. Dennis most likely reading from the will, his cadence predictable. I imagined the room, cousins sitting stiffly in borrowed suits, Ansora clutching her handbag like it was a shield, Yena pretending not to glance at her phone. The handle felt cool under my fingers. I didn't knock. I opened the door mid-sentence. Heads turned. The air shifted, not loud, but definite, like someone had cracked a window in a room sealed too long. Dennis froze. His mouth was still open, lips caught on a word he didn't finish. He was seated at the head of the table, posture perfect, fingers steepled, like he belonged there, by default. He blinked. I didn't speak. I crossed the room slowly, my boots soft against the carpet. My coat hung neatly against my frame, the folder balanced in one hand. Dennis cleared his throat. "Who told you to come?" he asked. His voice wasn't angry, just off balance, like he'd expected to play the final act with no audience interruption. I didn't answer. I turned to the estate attorney, Charles Lynde, seated just beside Dennis, his expression unreadable. I placed the folder on the table in front of him, slid it across the polished wood like it belonged there, because it did. He looked at me, then at Dennis, then opened it, hand steady. The room watched. Paper slid from envelope, pages unfolded. He skimmed the first, then read the second, this one out loud. My client, J. Kim, wishes to amend his will to include... The words rang louder than they were spoken. The room didn't breathe. Dennis shifted in his seat, a twitch at the corner of his mouth. His hand flexed once against the table, then stopped. The attorney continued reading. My name, the lake house, the notarized timestamp, a signed directive from J. Kim himself. Every syllable dismantled the illusion Dennis had built, one line at a time. And I watched his reflection in the glass wall behind him. I watched the moment he realized the story was no longer his to tell. When he finished, Charles folded the page slowly and set it down with deliberate care. His fingers rested atop it for a moment, anchoring it in place as if to say, "This stays." The room was still. No one moved. Aunt Zora's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Yena glanced at me, eyes wide, unsure whether to look away or lean in closer. Across the table, one of the cousins shifted in his seat, the chair creaking under the strain of discomfort. Dennis stared at the document like it might start burning. He opened his mouth. This wasn't part of the... Charles raised a hand, calm but final. The amendment is valid. It was notarized and filed. I have a copy in my records, identical to this one. Mr. Kim made it explicitly clear that this should override any previous terms regarding the lake house. Dennis's jaw tightened. But he... The signature is verifiable, Charles interrupted, eyes flat. And the witnesses listed have already been contacted. Your father made his intentions clear. A pause. And in writing. The silence that followed wasn't stunned. It was revealing. People began to see Dennis not as the grieving son, but as something else. His carefully crafted posture, composed, in control, began to unravel around the edges. Yena leaned slightly toward me, whispered, almost to herself, "He told us everything was final." I didn't reply. I didn't have to, because the truth was already laid bare, printed in black ink, read aloud by a voice he couldn't dismiss. Dennis tried again. There must have been a misunderstanding. My father was getting forgetful, confused near the end. Maybe he didn't realize what he was signing. Charles didn't blink. I spent over 30 years working with your father. His mind was intact. His decisions were precise. The room was ice. Dennis looked around, but no one came to his defense. The performance had ended, the audience had turned, and I remained still, not triumphant, just steady. Because justice, when it arrives quietly, does not knock. It walks in, takes its seat, and stays. Dennis stood. It wasn't dramatic, no slammed fists or raised voices. Just a slow rise from his chair, the kind that suggests someone trying to reclaim a crumbling center of gravity. "This is a mistake," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the documents like they were debris. "My father didn't tell me anything about this. Not once." Charles looked up at him, unbothered. "That doesn't change its validity." "But he always said..." Dennis cut himself off, lips pressing into a line. The attorney waited. Dennis's eyes flicked around the room. No nods of agreement, no rescue. Only relatives watching him the way one might watch a man trying to shovel water, futile, frantic, beneath the surface. He turned to me then, like I'd conjured all of it. "You really think he meant to cut me out?" he asked, voice laced with something that wanted to be hurt, but landed closer to accusation. I met his gaze evenly. "I think he meant to protect what mattered." It was the only thing I said in that room. Dennis's jaw flexed, but he didn't reply. Not to that. There was nowhere for it to go. Charles cleared his throat and returned to his notes. "The lake house has now been legally transferred to Ava Kim. All documentation has been filed accordingly. If any further disputes are raised, they can be handled through the appropriate channels." His voice was calm, dismissive in a professional way. Dennis sat back down. Not like a man choosing to rest, but like a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted and he had no choice but to follow. Ansora finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Why wouldn't he just tell us? Nobody answered, because the truth was layered. Quiet, carved in the small, steady moments between a granddaughter and the man who raised her like a legacy, was something lived, not claimed. And in the stillness that followed, no one dared question it again. The protest had been made, and it had been defeated. The last summer we spent at the lake house was the quietest one. He had more trouble walking then, his steps slower, knees stiff from years of crouching in gardens and carrying more weight than he let on. I would trail behind him on the wooden deck, offering an arm he rarely took, preferring to steady himself on the railing, his palm flat against the grain. "You don't have to stay all season," he told me once, while we sipped barley tea on the porch. "You're young. You should be somewhere brighter." I remember setting my cup down and answering without hesitation. "This is where I want to be." He didn't say anything for a while, just stared out across the water, where the afternoon sun cast long gold lines across the surface like brushstrokes. Then he nodded, slow and small, one of those nods that felt like approval and apology in the same breath. We didn't talk about the will that summer, but he did start leaving things for me. Subtle things. A garden journal with my name written on the inside cover. A ring of old keys left on the windowsill with a note, just in case I forget where I put them. A box of photographs, some I'd never seen. Black and white prints of him as a young man, standing beside a boat I didn't recognize. On the back, in faded ink, "First house." Before I knew what home really meant. I didn't know then what he was preparing me for, but now, looking back, it's clear. He was giving me the story in fragments, trusting I would piece it together when the time came. The lake house was never about inheritance. It was about memory. The sound of gravel underfoot, the creak of old floorboards at night, the smell of rain-soaked pine and unfinished tea. He wanted those things to live in someone who would remember, not just the place, but the person who kept it alive. And in his quiet way, he told me, "It's yours." Not with ceremony, but with presence. When the reading ended, no one stood right away. The room held its breath, as if movement might confirm something they didn't want to name. Dennis leaned back in his chair, fingers templed in front of his face. His expression wasn't fury. It was something slower, more calculating. Like a man realizing his plan had been perfect, except for the part he couldn't control. Me. Across the table, Aunt Sora reached for her bag without a word. Her bracelets clinked against the polished wood, the only sound in the silence. Yena looked between us, confused and curious, her eyes darting from Dennis to me and back again. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally asked, "Why didn't he just tell everyone?" Before, Charles spoke instead. Sometimes clarity doesn't come through confrontation. It comes through certainty. Mr. Kim didn't want a debate. He wanted a record. Dennis let out a quiet laugh, bitter, thin. A record that makes me the villain. Charles didn't flinch. The record makes no claims. It only speaks for itself. I gathered my coat slowly. The folder remained on the table, its purpose fulfilled. I had no desire to hold it any longer than necessary. Dennis turned to me one last time, his voice low, almost too calm. He gave you that place because you stayed, not because you earned it. I met his gaze, not coldly, not kindly, just steadily. Sometimes staying is the hardest thing to do. He blinked like he hadn't expected an answer at all. One by one, the rest of the family slipped out. Some murmured brief goodbyes, others avoided my eyes entirely. No one said Dennis was right, but no one said he wasn't, not out loud. I walked out last, leaving him at the head of a table that no longer bowed to him. As I stepped into the hallway, the door clicked shut behind me. The sound was soft, but it echoed. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Each floor passed in silence, numbers blinking red above the doors, a countdown to something that didn't feel like victory, just release. Outside, the air was brisk. Early autumn, the kind that carries the scent of old leaves and distant smoke. I walked slowly toward the parking garage, the weight in my chest shifting with every step. Not lighter, just settled. When I reached my car, I sat behind the wheel with the door still open, letting the wind thread through the quiet. My hands rested in my lap, fingers still curled from gripping the coat too tightly. The folder was gone. The letter had done its job. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. Calm, pale, eyes unreadable, like his. I drove without music, the roads familiar, traffic slow but forgiving. Each red light gave me time to breathe, to think, not about Dennis, not even about the family, just about him. My grandfather would have hated the spectacle of it. The formal room, the tense faces, the sudden shift of legacy turned courtroom. He was a man of quiet gestures, of planting things he'd never see bloom, of making decisions beneath the surface, like roots growing in secret. When I reached home, I didn't go inside right away. I stood on the porch, fingers grazing the worn wood of the railing. I could still feel the echo of his voice, the way he said my name like it meant something beyond sound. Inside, I slipped off my coat, hung it by the door, and walked to the small wooden box on the mantel, the one that held a pressed camellia he'd given me 2 springs ago, petals brittle but intact. I opened the lid and placed the letter inside, not to hide it, but to lay it down. It wasn't a weapon anymore. It was history, and I didn't need to carry it with me to know it was mine. I drove up to the lake house the next morning. The road hadn't changed, still narrow, still lined with pines that leaned toward each other like old friends keeping secrets. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, a sound that lived deep in memory. It was the same route I took every summer, except this time I drove alone. The gate creaked when I pushed it open. A single crow startled from a branch above and disappeared into the trees. The house stood quiet, not abandoned, just waiting. Its white paint had faded to a soft gray. The shutters needed attention, and the steps to the porch sagged more than they used to. But the roof held. The windows gleamed beneath a film of dust, and the door still stuck slightly when I turned the handle. Inside, everything smelled like cedar and thyme. I stepped through each room slowly, fingers gracing the edges of tables, picture frames, doorknobs. My reflection caught in the hallway mirror. Older, steadier. A woman who had returned not for permission, but because the place was hers. In the kitchen, the teapot still sat on the back burner. Same one he used to swear whistled too soon. I ran my hand along the counter. still scratched from where he insisted on chopping vegetables without a board. Upstairs, the bedroom windows overlooked the lake. The water was flat, unmoving, mirroring the overcast sky. I sat on the edge of the bed, his old bed, and let my eyes close. No voices, no papers, just wood and water and air that hadn't been touched by city breath. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't moved, but because this didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, finally permitted to start. I spent the rest of the day sweeping the porch, unlocking the shed, making a list of repairs, small things, manageable, the kind of work that built meaning over time. That evening, I made tea on the same stove where he used to hum while cooking rice. I stood on the dock with the mug in both hands, the lake stretching out before me, still and wide. He wasn't gone. Not really. He was in the silence, in the structure, in the keys that now rested, finally, in my pocket. The first message came that night. I was sitting by the fireplace with a blanket over my legs, the tea gone cold beside me, when my phone buzzed once. Just a name. Dennis. I think we need to talk. No punctuation, no greeting, just the kind of message someone sends when they've realized the door might have closed and too much was left unsaid. I didn't respond. The second message came the next morning. There are things you don't understand. Things Dad never told you. Still, I said nothing. By the third, his tone had shifted. You blindsided everyone. You should have come to me first. I turned the phone over and let the screen go dark. His voice, even in writing, still carried the same rhythm. Deflect, reframe, redirect. He wanted to recast himself, not as the deceiver, but as someone caught off guard, misrepresented. He didn't ask how I was. Didn't ask what I remembered. Just circled himself, like always. Later, Yina called. She didn't mention Dennis, just asked quietly, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I told her. And I was. Not happy, not light, but whole. She hesitated. It was a lot, back there. I know. Silence again. Then, I think he thought no one would challenge him. I let that sit, because that was the truth. Dennis had moved through life like a man protected by proximity. Eldest son, family fixer, the one who stayed polished even when others cracked. He wore belief like armor. That charisma excused corners cut, that charm made deceit palatable. But my grandfather had seen it, understood it, and decided it would end with him. I spent the rest of the day walking the perimeter of the house, making notes, marking small repairs with strips of blue painter's tape, reclaiming it, not as a prize, but as a responsibility. By dusk, the sky turned a cool slate. The lake caught its reflection like it always had, honest, unflinching, and I knew then, Dennis's noise couldn't reach me here. Because silence, when earned, doesn't feel like absence. It feels like peace. I found the ledger in the back of the closet, bound in brown leather, corners frayed, pages lined with dates and margins filled with neat, square writing, his handwriting. Each entry marked a moment, repairs made, flowers planted, guests who stayed. The ledger wasn't financial, it was personal, a record of care. The last entry was dated 6 months before he passed. Ava pruned the garden today. I stayed inside and watched her through the window. She worked slowly but with intent, the same way her grandmother did. I closed the book gently, hands resting on the cover. This was what Dennis would never understand. Legacy isn't built in last-minute revisions or grand declarations. It's built in afternoons like that, quiet ones, where nothing monumental happens, but everything meaningful lives. In shared silence, in observed habits, in who you trust with your presence when your strength is fading. He chose me, not out of obligation, not to settle a score, but because I had stayed. Because when everything else was busy claiming, I had simply been there, listening, watching, learning the language of quiet care. That afternoon, I took a box of old tools down from the shed, oiled the hinges, repaired a loose step on the porch. It wasn't dramatic, but it felt right. Every nail, every stroke of the brush was a kind of conversation with him, one that didn't need words. The wind picked up near dusk, carrying with it the smell of pine and lake water. I stood barefoot on the dock, the boards warm underfoot from the day's sun. The letter was tucked away now, sealed in a drawer where it belonged, not as ammunition, but as evidence of love expressed through protection. I breathed in deep, the kind of breath that fills more than lungs. He had given me more than a house. He had given me the means to defend it. And in doing so, he gave me something rarer than property. He gave me certainty. He gave me choice. And he gave me the quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to be announced, only lived. I kept the deed in a slim envelope, tucked behind the ledger, not displayed, not framed, just present, like the rest of this place. Solid, understated, enough. The calls from Dennis stopped after a week. No apologies came, no explanations either, just a final message, short and bitter. Enjoy it. He always preferred you. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say to a man who mistook silence for surrender until the moment it stood up and walked past him. I began spending weekends at the lake house, then weeks. I repaired what I could, replaced only what needed to be. Left the creaks in the floorboards, the uneven hinge on the pantry door, not because I was lazy, but because he'd left them that way too. Because not everything broken needs to be fixed. Some things just need to be known. The neighbors remembered me. The elderly couple across the lake waved when they saw the lights come back on. One of them, Mrs. Park, brought over rice cookies and a folded newspaper with a note. He told us you'd come back. I sat on the dock that night with the cookies untouched beside me, watching the sky peel back its color. He never needed a legacy built in plaques or foundations. He built it in the space he protected, in the way he left it behind, and in the one person he trusted to hold it when he no longer could. I don't carry his name like Dennis does, but I carry his rhythm, his restraint, his quiet judgment, and now I carry his house too, not as inheritance, but as memory given form, as truth rooted deep. Some mornings I wake before the sun. The lake is still then, wrapped in mist, the trees standing like sentinels along the shoreline. I sit on the porch with a blanket over my shoulders and watch the light arrive slowly, without asking permission. That's how truth moves, not like thunder, like dawn. I keep his letter in a drawer I open less and less, not because I've forgotten what it says, but because I've memorized the parts that matter. If anything feels off, you'll know what to do. He trusted me to act when it counted. Not loudly, just clearly. People still ask what happened with the will, the ones who weren't in the room. They come at it sideways, cloaked in concern or curiosity. I give them the same answer every time. He left me what he wanted to last. They don't always understand, but they nod. And that's enough. I never told Dennis about the letter. Never showed him the handwriting, the seal, the part at the end where my grandfather wrote, "This is not for debate. This is for her." Because he didn't deserve it. Not the words, not the clarity, and not the grace of knowing how deeply he was seen. I keep the lake house plain. No new paint, no renovations, just care. The way he did, slowly, steadily. I sweep the porch. I tend the garden. I leave the bedroom untouched. I've grown into the silence he left behind. It doesn't echo anymore. It holds. And some days, when I close my eyes on that dock, the air thick with cedar and thyme. I hear it, not his voice, not his instructions, just the feeling he trusted I'd remember. You don't have to raise your voice to be right. You just have to know when to stand and never sit back down.